In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the anthropological concept of the Stranger King. And I'm going to use it to help you to understand Donald Trump in relation to Venezuela, but also Trump in the context of the USA. Now, the Stranger King concept is associated with an anthropologist called Marshall Sahlins. Now, Marshall Sahlins is a major figure in cultural anthropology. He was also the doctoral supervisor of David Graeber, who's another very well-known anthropologist who's very influential upon me. Now, in this video, I'm going to do three things. Firstly, I'm going to introduce you to Sahlins' concept of the Stranger King. Secondly, I'm going to show you how this applies to the current situation in Venezuela. And thirdly, I'm going to show you how it relates to the MAGA movement more generally in the USA. So let's start with an overview of the concept of the Stranger King. So if you reach back into history, you'll find many of these mythological tales of the Stranger King repeated across different cultures. Now, these Stranger King stories all have a common structure. They are generally set in some troubled ancient regime in which some local despot is in control, surrounded by various bickering elites. The despot will find himself challenged by a foreign stranger with mysterious and sometimes even supernatural origins. The stranger is often young and handsome and violent, and he also has a willingness to bend societal norms or step outside of them. The despot will try to outwit or outfight the newcomer, but is defeated by their greater trickery or sheer force. What then happens is that the outsider usurps the power and founds a new kingdom. Now, there are many examples of these Stranger King myths. Anthropologists have found them in places like Polynesia, Melanesia, Sulawesi, and the East African Rift Valley. Classicists can also find many examples in Greek and Roman mytho-histories. Check out, for example, this video here by Olaf Almquist, in which he demonstrates the Stranger King credentials of rulers like Aeneas, Pelops, Cyrus the Great, and Sargon of Akkad. Even the mythical founder of Rome, Romulus, has a kind of Stranger King vibe. More than this, many dynasties will actually often seek to trace their origins back to an ancient Stranger King. For example, the 16th century Mexico ruler, Moctezuma, reportedly said that he descended from a lineage of strangers who immigrated hither from a very distant land. If we're going to talk about Stranger Kings, however, we also have to talk about the legendary anthropologist Marshall Sahlins. Sahlins collected these Stranger King myths and took time to analyze them, and his writing on Stranger Kings begins in 1982, and his last work on the topic was a collaboration with the late David Graeber in 2017 in a book called On Kings. So in this book, Sahlins and Graeber note some key features of the Stranger King. Let's look at some passages here. So they note that on his way to the kingdom, the dynastic founder is notorious for exploits of incest, fratricide, patricide, or other crimes against kinship and common morality. He may also be famous for defeating dangerous natural or human foes, and manifests a nature above, beyond, and greater than the people he is destined to rule, hence his power to do so. The monstrous and violent nature of the king remains an essential condition of his sovereignty. The Stranger King might be monstrous, but by stepping outside of normal rules, he creates this mystique, this kind of sense that he has access to powers beyond the ordinary world. And this can actually become a source of legitimacy in the eyes of people. Equally important, however, according to Marshall Sahlins, is that the Stranger King doesn't merely conquer the people, but enters into some kind of social contract with them. So Sahlins notes that there is invariably a tradition of contract, notably in the form of marriage between the stranger prince and a marked woman of the indigenous people, most often a daughter of the native leader. Sovereignty is embodied and transmitted in the native woman, who constitutes the bond between the foreign intruders and the local people. So not only will the woman domesticate the otherwise dangerous outsider, but local elites will also see opportunities to reform themselves around the Stranger King, seeing in this external power a kind of potential to overcome their own internal divisions or turmoil. So, while these Stranger King myths might involve these heroic, violent, or otherworldly power grabs, they aren't necessarily stories of straightforward conquest. In fact, they're often stories of usurpation. And Sahlins also notes that this pattern actually occurs in various fairly recent actual historical situations, in which local groups who have all their own internal politics going on might actually have their own reasons for taking on an external king. He says that Even in the case of major kingdoms such as the Benin or the Mexica, the initiative may indeed come from the indigenous people who solicit a prince from a powerful outside realm. So this framing of Stranger Kings gives us a bit more of a multifaceted lens through which to view colonization, actually. Sahlins actually notes that the pattern followed by colonists could actually play into and echo pre-existing Stranger King myths and traditions. One example is that of Captain Cook, who was reputedly greeted by Hawaiians in 1779 as an avatar of the ancient god Lono, who was thought to be returning. Then there's the case of James Brooke, the White Raja of Sarawak, whom the local Iban people considered to be the son or lover of their primordial goddess Kiling. We also have the case of Hernan Cortes, who was reputedly greeted by Moctezuma as the deity Quetzalcoatl. The common thread here is that the colonist is perceived as a type of mystical outsider. Now, there's lots of academic controversy around these different cases and how indigenous people were interacting with these colonial leaders, but the takeaway point is that colonists are seldom experienced in black and white terms, precisely because they often arrive into the already grey context of pre-colonial politics, with different sections of an indigenous population seeing in them different things. Now, at this point, it's very important to flag up that colonists always have a vested interest in claiming that they are warmly welcomed by the local population. European colonists, for example, imagined themselves as bringers of light on some kind of mission to civilize savages, who they imagined as living in a primitive state of turmoil and godlessness. That said, what Sahlins' discussion of Stranger Kings tends to do is to highlight the ambiguity in foreign takeovers, because the arrival of the violent outside king might actually present opportunities for local elites who may be prepared to collaborate or take a chance on this external power. They may actually see certain uses in these distant, aloof strangers who don't seem to be subject to the same rules of engagement as the locals are. For example, David Henley studied the case of the indigenous Minahasa people in Indonesia. He found that certain sections of the Minahasa population saw a certain usefulness in the 17th century Dutch East India Company, in particular because this stranger king tends to have a kind of aloofness from local rivalries and an ability to provide relatively impartial conflict resolution. Now, the Dutch East India Company was unambiguously self-interested, extractive, and colonial. The point is that rather than being mere bystanders to it, local people often had an ambiguous entanglement with entities like that. They experience the coercive violence of the colonist, but may still take a gamble on a stranger king. So let's use this framework to start thinking about Donald Trump. Now, on January the 12th, 2026, Donald Trump posted a picture of himself on Truth Social with the tag, "Acting President of Venezuela." He really isn't making any attempt to hide the fact that his takeover of the country is unambiguously colonial. And it's in this context that we start to see little elements of the Stranger King myth starting to turn up. For example, the conservative press has quite predictably fixated on the pre-existing dictator, the figure of Maduro, and his spectacular humiliation and overthrow at the hands of a cunning outsider brimming with almost supernatural vitality. There are all these stories about the jubilation of exiled Venezuelans, weeping with joy and thanking Trump. Then we have all the stories about the blatant geopolitics of this. Unlike George W. Bush during the Iraq War, Trump has made almost no effort to disguise the fact that his regime change efforts are all about the oil. In fact, he's loudly proclaimed that it's about the oil. He's actually gone out of his way to talk about how the US multinationals will literally take over the country. This makes it very, very easy for the left-wing press to point out the very, very obvious imperial dynamics of this resource grab. In fact, even the centrist and conservative press are going to really struggle to ignore that. Let's just forget about the global press response for a moment, though, and think about the situation through the eyes of many Venezuelans, because we have here various elements of a potential Stranger King situation. Okay, Trump isn't exactly a young, handsome challenger, but he certainly is a foreigner who doesn't feel encumbered by traditional rules. In fact, the blatant impunity of his oil grab kind of adds to the sense of awe and mystique around him, and he certainly has deposed a local despot. Now, at the risk of pushing the framework too far, we even find strange echoes of the mythological marriage to the daughter element of the traditional Stranger King story. The female power players of Venezuela, like Delcy Rodriguez and Maria Corina Machado, must now domesticate this outsider by entering into deals with him. Crucially, while the US actions have thrown the Venezuelan establishment into turmoil, there already was turmoil in the pre-colonial situation. So this new incursion has actually simultaneously opened up various new opportunities for local elites and for exiled elites, some of whom have long been seeking some way out of the situation. So this could actually end up being a usurpation rather than a conquest, with potential for elites to strike a new social contract with the foreign power. Now let's take a moment though to quickly unpack that very loaded phrase and to see how it relates to the Stranger King concept. Now this term social contract is heavily associated with classic liberal theory, and classic liberal theory is a heavily abstract way of thinking about the world. Now when I say liberal here, I don't mean it in the modern US political sense, but rather in the original philosophical sense. Early liberal philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke basically started from the assumption that humans are 1. Individuals, 2. Rational, and 3. Possessing of some kind of natural individual rights. Now from that opening position, they basically then describe social formations as collections of individuals who have rationally come together. Now this actually sets a scene for mainstream economics, which basically says the same thing but applies it to economic interactions. Now in the case of standard economics, they imagine all these individuals choosing to come together to form markets. But in the case of our 17th century Hobbes, he was imagining all these solo rational individuals choosing to come together to form, well, a kind of absolutist monarchy to rule over them. And this is partly why Hobbes is sometimes misinterpreted as being illiberal. In his 1651 classic Leviathan, he explains that a monarch is a creation of individuals who have chosen to give up part of their freewheeling but chaotic freedom, which they would have in a state of nature, in order to enter into a more constraining social contract in which the monarch will provide some kind of structure, like property rights, law and order, so that the individuals can go about pursuing their self-interest without being disrupted by disputes, theft, instability, and infighting. Now, in its own context, Hobbes' Leviathan was actually an attack on the idea that monarchs derive their power from a god, and this is partly why he was actually accused of atheism. But by describing kings as being the secular creation of individuals, he also implied that individuals could actually dissolve the social contract if necessary and return to being in a state of nature. Now, this was a politically radical statement to make in the context of 17th century England, but as a generalized account of actual human history, it is kind of bullshit. Precisely because, like all classic liberal theory, it starts from the ahistorical assumption that humans actually are individuals and that social formations are chosen. In reality, though, every person in history has always been born into an existing social context. In other words, societal enmeshment always precedes any perception of being an individual, rather than the other way around. It's really only in edge cases that we find a random collection of fully grown adults who are somehow untethered from society and able to then explicitly make some new social contract with each other. For example, the only time I've actually ever experienced a social contract was when I became naturalized as a British citizen. And in that ceremony, I was given a literal list of my rights and obligations. But of course, no actual British-born person has ever seen this, and none of them ever chose to enter into this contract. Still, these edge cases are important, and in many ways, Stranger King myths describe one type of edge case. In a pre-existing society in a state of turmoil, it is possible for some foreign ruler to appear to people as some kind of Leviathan figure that can be contracted with by allowing them to usurp. This actually might make some kind of rational sense to people who might be entangled in some otherwise intractable conflict and who might be prepared to dissolve that situation by jumping ship to a new one. Now, this is not to say that this will actually work out for the people involved, but this does help us to move past these binary perspectives on the current situation in Venezuela. Now, on the one hand, I do find Trump to be an obnoxious narcissist, and he's now upping the stakes by becoming a kind of unapologetic colonizer too. But I can still actually understand the gamble being taken by, for example, a Venezuelan exile who agrees to grant some leeway to him. Now, I'm going to conclude by going one layer deeper, because I actually think the Stranger King myth is crucial to understanding the entire Trump show, beyond his current Venezuelan adventures. Just think about this for a moment. In the run-up to all his political campaigns, Trump has always presented himself as some kind of heroic outcast, some kind of prodigal son in exile who's been shunned by the establishment. The twist here is that he's not actually technically a foreigner in the US, but he does fashion himself as a local son that's become estranged from his true home, unfairly misrepresented by the New York Times, mocked by Hollywood, disrespected by Time magazine, and so on. From this starting point, the mythology unfolds. So the estranged son returns as some kind of stranger king with a celestial mandate, on some kind of mission to form a contract with the people against some kind of despotic deep state. This then justifies overriding all the pre-existing norms, checks, and balances. So I wrote this essay last year called Making Capitalism Bad Again, in which I noted that at least part of the euphoria that surrounds Trump comes from the fact that he gave permission to people to ignore the cognitive dissonance that characterizes liberal versions of capitalism. The sense that you're supposed to be a good boy and a bad boy at the same time. And by taking on this bad boy mantle, he indeed actually appeared to many people as some kind of monstrous outsider who was not subject to the niceties of the society. Now, in presenting himself as being above and beyond all these existing norms, he could actually take on that stranger king immunity. Now, through this lens, all these actions previously considered reprehensible, like attacking the press, or centralizing power into the executive, or threatening the judiciary, or defunding the universities, or attacking the Federal Reserve, or sending in the National Guard to quell protests, etc., can all be framed as signs that this stranger king isn't subject to the rules of the realm, and thereby draws his power from some kind of distant, mystical source. Now that becomes a sign of his legitimacy in the eyes of his followers. This partly explains that dichotomy you find in perceptions around Trump, where you'll have certain parts of, for example, the centrist community who feel horrified by his actions, while his followers are often delighted by the same thing. In many ways, this follows Stranger King narratives in which the monstrous actions of the outsider are actually viewed with awe by those who follow them. Now, returning to Sahlins, the Stranger King often comes to power not through conquest, but by usurpation, aided and abetted by a local population, who see in them a certain usefulness. It's worth noting that there are many people who voted for Trump not because they particularly liked him, but simply because they took a chance on him, seeing him as this kind of proverbial stranger and ignoring his obvious inconsistencies and hypocrisies and flaws, while focusing on his outsider status, which gives him this almost quasi-supernatural vibe. The problem, though, is that given that Trump is obviously heavily narcissistic, this Stranger King story is probably playing out in his own head too. In a political sense, he's currently triumphant, but at an emotional level, he remains deeply vulnerable and incredibly thin-skinned, and also increasingly maniacal. Now, the Trump show might have exploded in 2024 and been wildly popular, but as he gets increasingly lost in his own mythology about himself, he increasingly loses sight of those who brought him to power. So, as he screws over the US shale gas industry by flooding the US with Venezuelan oil in an attempt to deal with inflation caused by tariffs, or as he sides with the big tech barons who couldn't give a stuff about the workers of the Rust Belt, or as he disses the CEO of ExxonMobil, or whatever, he makes more and more enemies of people who took a gamble on him. Everyone is still smiling deferentially at the Stranger King, but it's entirely possible that they're all waiting for that moment in which a newer, younger, and more handsome stranger sets foot in the land. If you found this video useful or thought-provoking, please do give it a like and please do subscribe. And please do let me know in the comments whether you think this framework applies to Trump, or whether you know of any other rulers who might be considered to be stranger kings in modern times. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.